All right, hey, welcome back. I know it's been a while. It's been a little while, but
Yeah.
you know what? Things happened.
Happy Halloween.
Yes, definitely. All Saints Day.
Reformation Day.
Yeah,
We got 'em
everything else along those lines. But anyway, we're going to dive into some really good stuff this time around. We're going
Yeah.
to start a new series, looking at the end of the war, World War One, that is, and helping to explain, well, why World War II even began.
Well, I think our plan is probably to go all the way through World War II
Yeah.
and probably well into the Cold War.
At least the first 10
Because,
years.
World War II is an apocalypse.
It is.
It literally destroys everything that's left of the old world and creates a new world.
Which is so weird. So weird to think that it's a quote unquote apocalypse. Now I know you as a pastor, you kind of have an understanding of that idea of an apocalypse in a different sense that any other person would.
Yes, but this really does. It's just there's really hardly any aspect of our lives, political, economic, social, that isn't changed in some fashion.
Well, you got to think about it. What does come out of World War One and Two? You have a large rise in the end of imperialism.
Oh, well,
Which-
yeah, it's breathing its last
Right.
as the war ends,
Right.
and we'll talk more about that as we go. As we get closer to the end of World War II.
Right.
Right now, we're at the end of World War One because it sets the stage. Pretty much any historian you read or talk to or see on TV will tell you that the end of World War One, specifically the Treaty of Versailles,
Mm-hmm.
is what led directly to World War II.
No doubt. No doubt. I mean, it is. Some people say, well, there's no causation with correlation. No, this one is true. There is nothing but it. So let's just go ahead, dive in head first. What in the world is going on right now? It's November 1918. We had signed the armistice. Who are the winners? Who are the losers?
Well, I mean, it's bleak. It's doom, despair, and misery on us.
Of course.
Because, I mean, you've churned up, 600 miles of France,
Yep.
mostly.
Yeah.
Part of Belgium. And the casualties, the number of casualties, I didn't even look up the full number.
Right.
France loses almost 2 million dead when you add soldiers and civilians together, which is real close to 5% of their whole population. 1 in 6 of the people they put in uniform is dead. Another million are crippled,
Right.
not just injured, crippled,
Right.
missing limbs, blind, all sorts of other things that just. And France really bears the burden. Germany loses a very similar number of men, actually a little bit more, closer to almost 3 million, but they have a much bigger population. It's about down closer to 3% of their population.
When you got to really think about it again, the French are the ones that not only are feeling the brunt in terms of the death toll, but how much land is just annihilated in the French countryside.
Well, it's been occupied and
It's
turned
been-
into supply depots and hospitals
Right.
and everything for the German army that's occupied.
And you realize again the amount of crater holes that are made from those mortars and just the pure death on that battlefield. You can't go
You still-
to places of Alsace-Lorraine or along that German-French border without seeing the scars of that.
And it seems like every couple of years or something they find an artillery shell
Right,
that hadn't exploded.
right.
Luckily, most of them are pretty inert by now.
I'd hope so anyway. It's
Germany
been
is
over
the same
100
thing with
years.
bombs.
Right.
I mean, those aren't necessarily inert.
No.
But France bears the brunt for the Allies. Great Britain, another 3%, 1.4 million dead. Now that's spread over Great Britain and Canada and Australia.
Yes, the Anzacs, Australia, New Zealand. You
For that
even
matter,
have
probably
Indian-
Jamaica's,
Right.
Indians.
You've got people from the subcontinent of India. You've got people from
All over.
Central America, everywhere
Yeah.
coming and fighting. And again, that's the difference here between World War One and World War Two per se. You see a lot more of those imperial style of fights.
Yeah,
But-
yeah. And the French, of course, the Senegalese especially were fought a lot in France itself. Of course,
Right.
it's easy to get them right up right up from Africa,
Yes.
as opposed to their colonies that are deeper in. But Italy, 3% of the population. Russia, a little less than 2, but still 3 million dead.
And that, again, you got to put that a caveat on Russia as well. And we'll talk more about this later on in this episode. But Russia was only in it for 3 years.
Yeah, but they were really bad at it.
Yeah. Yes, they were. They literally just would throw people in the front lines.
Tannenberg and the guys out there, Bismarck.
Mow them down. Just mow them down.
Not Bismarck. Hindenburg.
Yes.
That's the guy.
Paul von Hindenburg.
I mean, he just ran rings around them, and this is with an infantry army.
Right.
That's pretty amazing. But anyway, not to get too far, but so the end of the war comes, all the powers, good and bad, have lost anywhere from 2 to 5% of their populations, which is, it's hard to say that, but we've just been through COVID where we've lost basically 1 million, which is less than a third of a percent.
Right.
And it's one of the most horrific things that's hit in the United States in a long time. Well, since the Spanish flu, foreshadowing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, let's get some foreshadowing going on.
But the winners, France is a winner. They might not feel like it every day, but they're a winner.
Yes.
The Great Britain and its empire. Italy is a winner. They switch sides just in time.
Unfortunately, Italy is a flip-flopper.
Right, but they flip-flopped the right way this time.
Correct.
So, and then of course the United States, and really when you look at in the sense of losses versus gains, the United States comes out of it so great. They pick up a bunch of little islands in the Pacific which mean nothing.
Right.
But economically, it really spurs on another industrial revolution in America.
It does.
At the cost of what, 117,000? I don't want to make
roughly.
I don't want to make light of that.
Right.
But
one death is too many.
When you compare that to the population, which was 100 million,
right,
you see that the numbers don't even stack up at all compared to the European losses.
No.
And so you have a devastated continent. But, these 4 have won. And of course they have their little allies and stuff like that.
Right.
Like Serbia comes out the big winner. They start the whole war.
Yeah.
Assassinating, Archduke Ferdinand.
Right.
They end up being the dominant force in a new Yugoslavia, but we'll talk about that with the
Treaty of Versailles.
Treaty of Versailles.
Mm-hmm.
The Central Powers.
Oh yes.
2 of them don't even exist by the time the treaty is signed.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. Right as the war is taking place, you have 2 major empires one in Central Europe, the other in southwestern Asia, and parts of Europe as well. You have here what is today Turkey, but before it was the Ottoman
Ottoman Empire.
Unfortunately, they were called the sick man of Europe for many years.
They'd been struggling. They'd lost Greece in the 1800s with Lord Byron.
Yeah,
going to volunteer. They'd lost Albania.
Right. They were on the verge of just destruction.
Oh yeah, they'd lost Egypt and all sorts of things.
And there's also, of course, the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
The Habsburg Empire.
That's right.
That's really, when you think about the Habsburg Empire, which was founded in 1000?
Yes.
Real close to 1000 AD. So it's 900-year-old empire.
Gone.
Just disintegrates. I mean, It's a bunch of countries. It's not like Turkey where the Ottomans, yes, they disintegrated, but Turkey stayed a country.
Right. It is a multitude. 5 different countries.
5 or 6 different countries.
Somewhere around there. But again, the idea, of course, is that 2 of the 3 major central powers are obviously gone.
Yeah, just completely gone.
Completely gone off the face of the earth in terms of name and power.
Government at all.
Everything. But the real loser of the central powers is unfortunately still sticking around. And that is Germany. And we made mention the fact that, again, Germany loses 2.7 million people in the war.
Almost all soldiers.
Yes.
Because the war is not really fought.
Right.
There's some bombing raids into Germany, but bombers at that time don't carry a lot, so they don't do a ton of damage.
Right here along this line here, the Belgian border from the North Sea through Luxembourg and Alsace-Lorraine on this eastern side of France to the Swiss border is where most of the fighting takes place during this war. And so Germany Germany is very much unscathed, which is a good thing because again, like France on the opposing side are getting destroyed in their farms and causing a large amount of economic issues. Germany, if there was a different situation at the end of the war, I don't think Germany would have had such a big economic problem.
Well, they've been blockaded.
That too, yes.
And for all intents and purposes, they were running the war.
Right.
They had troops in the Ottoman Empire. They had troops in Italy fighting the Italians to help the Austrians. They'd
Yes.
been fighting the Russians. They were everywhere.
Right.
Because their allies, also foreshadowing for the next war,
Mm-hmm.
weren't very good at war.
No.
And
No, they
so
weren't.
they had to keep going other places and helping, which spread their forces thin, which of course, France should definitely have a church service every day thanking God for that.
Yes.
Because if they would have had those divisions, the 20 or 30, just it seems like not that many, consider the size of the armies, 20 or 30 divisions on the Verdun front, it might have ended the war.
Yeah.
In 1916.
Right.
And the French army revolts in late 1916.
And again, you realize that with all of this what ifs,
Mm-hmm.
it does put things into different perspective.
Yes, but Germany, being the only one left standing,
They get the brunt of it all.
they have to come to the table. The train car outside of Paris,
Oh, unfortunately, yes.
where they are basically, as the German government, which is now a democracy led
Yep.
by very liberal and left-wing leaning groups,
Correct. The Social Democrats.
Social Democrats and a couple other groups. They almost always have a coalition government,
Right.
Until the Nazis, really.
Yep.
They're forced. They have a dictated peace. They don't
Mhm.
have a choice. They can't stand up to an invasion.
No.
Their army is disastrous. Their people are starving because they've been blockaded. And it seems like Germany probably could have fed itself. But all economies, especially in the modern age, really after the 1800s,
Mhm.
the Industrial Revolution, they don't function well as an economy if they don't have a place for exports.
Right.
Everything starts to break down. It just like backs up, kind of like supply chain issues.
Yeah.
It really just backs up and starts causing problems in every sort of area because, maybe you're short of, I don't know, some sort of sulfate, which
Mhm.
goes into almost everything at this
Mhm.
time. Germany doesn't have it.
Your
Your chemical industry
yeah.
starts to go down, which means, of course, you're going to keep that sulfate for munitions instead of fertilizers.
Right.
And it
It's
it
done.
cascades,
You're gone.
and eventually the German Navy mutinies in
Yes.
Kiel, one
Yes.
of their major ports. And it really just, the Kaiser abdicates, and they sign the armistice, and eventually now, after all that, in a Europe already ravaged by war, and now the Spanish flu is running around. We'll talk about
gosh,
that towards
yes.
the end. But
Yes.
and the Allies, I want to specifically say the United Kingdom, France, and to a certain extent Italy.
Right, because Italy was on the Central Powers going into,
They were part of the Triple Entente
right,
and things like that.
The fact that they were on Germany's side in the beginning, they weren't so much wanting to destroy or have this revenge style on the Germans.
They just wanted to make sure they got those chunks of Austria and what would be Yugoslavia in any other day.
Yeah.
And it cuts Austria off from the ocean,
Mm-hmm.
or the sea, I guess, technically.
Yeah.
Which, of
still.
course, makes the Sound of Music so silly that the guy is a captain in the Austrian Navy. But anyway.
But we digress. The understanding, of course, is that, the British, they have lost, what would we said? We said
1.4 million
1.4
dead.
million. We have the French, not only the death toll, but again, the economic toll, the social aspect of the war. They wanted the Germans to be punished.
Yeah, the French, it changes their entire demographics. Because you're talking about nearly a quarter of a generation of young men, 18 to 25, are gone, just gone.
Right.
And then you have a whole another big gob of them, almost the same size, that are crippled in some fashion.
Right, whether it be a loss of a limb or, unfortunately, a loss of their manhood.
Yes.
And I mean the anatomical manhood.
Yes. Which, of course, and then of course you have the guys, losing chunks of their face or their whole face to burns. it takes a big chunk out of your breeding population. But, of course, the French, you got to give them some credit. Where there's a will, there's a way.
Yeah, they come up with some really interesting ways of dealing with this.
You see a rise in mistresses.
Right.
It's become almost a cliche that, you know, French men are supposed to have mistresses.
Yeah, well.
But you had so many unattached women.
Yeah.
That it became almost economically required. Now, granted, France at this time is still a very heavily Catholic country, wanting to keep traditional biblical morals as far as marriage is concerned, so they just toss one of the commandments out and just have mistresses.
Right.
And it's a strange thing. Lesbianism becomes a bigger thing. It shoots up to 4 or 5% of the female population instead of the 2 to 2.5 that it hovers in most societies. Because there's nowhere for these eligible women to go. I mean, they don't have a place to build a life.
Right. It is. You're right. It's an extreme. It's an extreme change in their societal understanding. Their norms have to adapt to what is taking place. And again, you know, when it comes to the Treaty of Versailles, this is why the French and this is why the British are meeting and not giving the Germans an opportunity to negotiate.
No, they're coming very vindictively to the table.
Correct.
They want territory because, well, that's a very 19th century thing to do at a treaty treaty. Well, 19th, 18th, 17th century. You take colonies. That's the loser has to give up colonies. That's just the rule of war.
Land is king.
And so, you know, the British pick up Syria? No, that was French.
No,
Iraq.
Yeah. They pick up
and
Iraq
Palestine.
And Palestine
from the Ottomans. They occupy the Ruhr Valley. It's in Germany until the 30s. Well, they don't occupy it, but it's technically a demilitarized zone.
Right.
And it takes away a big chunk of Germany's ability to pay reparations, which is the next one.
Right.
They want somebody to pay for this war. The British spent $35 billion of that time, which today would translate to about $600 billion.
That's a lot of money.
You know,
we're
half $1 trillion like that.
Right.
The French spent 24 billion. Germany spent. I mean, they spent a ton of money, a lot of money, and a lot of that money goes west.
Right.
Where American industry is building guns and ammo for these armies that are fighting in these huge scale battles. But we'll come back to that, you know. But they're the winners. Well, they're not the winners. We talked about the losers. Oh, we forgot about the winning loser, or the losing winner.
The losing winner, right. Whichever wish you'd like to say it here. But Russia, you know, Russia is the one we mentioned earlier that they'd only been in there for 3 years. Well, again, Russia was one of the leading individual countries during the outbreak of the war. And in fact, when we talk about the outbreak, you know, the Russians are the ones that are coming to the aid of the little brother.
Yeah, they're fellow Slavs in Serbia. And it's really, their mobilization is that point of no return.
Right.
Because they can't stop theirs very well. Their communications are bad. Once their army starts moving to the border, Germany and Austria have no choice but to mobilize, which activates the von Schlieffen Plan. Here we go.
And it just, of course, just one domino leads to the next. And the problem that we find, unfortunately, with the Russians is that they are, they are a backwater country.
They have been since Peter.
Yes.
Really, he tried to make them very European. It didn't work very well.
Well, you have a country that's spanning almost half the globe.
I can't imagine, 14 time zones or something like that?
Dang close.
It's a lot, I know that. But you have all this going on in Russia. The government collapses. The Tsar
is forced to abdicate.
The Kerensky government, which chooses the very poor name Provisional Government. Which proves to be very foreshadowing because it's very temporary.
Exactly.
And that's in March of 17.
Yes.
But Kerensky makes one fatal error. He commits to staying in the war.
Correct.
Which gives Germany the excuse to send V.I. Lenin by train into Russia. And it gives him that propaganda boost that I'm going to take you out of the war.
Yes. Bread, peace, and land.
Yes,
is what his major points were under this Bolshevism, as he called it. just a communist style of government.
Yes.
Again, we need food to survive.
And we're tired of being killed.
We're tired of being killed by the hundreds of thousands everywhere we look.
Yes.
And again, we must end this and give what is rightfully the people's, the land of Russia.
Break up all these counts and dukes
Yes.
who have all this land and have big parties, and everybody else
Starves.
eats mud.
Mm-hmm. So
yeah.
we see by October of 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, or November, depending on which calendar you look at.
Right.
But regardless
November
of it,
for us.
right? But you see now the Bolshevik Revolution taking place, Lenin overthrowing that provisional government and getting Russia out of the war.
But slowly.
Yes.
They don't sign the treaty until March of 1918. He drags his feet as long as he can. Only when the Germans threaten them with a resumption of hostilities does he sign.
Right, because you got to realize it was the Germans that put Lenin back into Russia. They could have easily taken him out.
Oh, well, the Russian army had disintegrated.
Right.
So if they wanted to walk to Moscow, there wasn't anybody in their way.
It was literally, they could have walked to the Volga
They could
and
have
no
walked
one
all
would
the
have
way.
said a word.
And so therefore, he signed.
Mhm.
But he did delay. It's one of the few things you can say good about Lenin. He did drag his feet to keep Russia, not so much in the war, but German forces on the Russian front out of the war.
Right.
Which, you know, in the end of the war, the Michael Offensive is all those divisions from the Russian front heading west.
Yes.
And if
reinforcing those.
if they would have been in place earlier
Mhm.
and built up to strength,
They-
it might not have ended as well.
No, I don't think so.
It could have been very bad in that summer offensive
For sure.
of 1917.
For sure.
Um,
But again, we talk here about the fact that, again, the Russians, they sign a separate peace treaty, an earlier peace treaty. So when it came to 1918, 1919 with the Treaty of Versailles that was put into play, they weren't even around.
they didn't get to have anything to say about the Baltic states being created.
Oh, no, they didn't have anything to do with Poland.
The Ukraine becomes its own entity.
They had nothing. They had no way of pleading their case.
Nope.
And you know what? Honestly, I don't know if France or Great Britain would have even allowed something as that. Because
Well,
again,
especially since they dropped out.
exactly.
If they would have stayed in the war to the end, maybe, but not.
But even then, I don't know how much influence they would have had.
And what would they given Russia? I guess probably parts of Poland, maybe. I don't know.
Possibly.
Or the Baltic states.
Yeah, but again, we never know.
We don't know.
won't
That's a
know.
what if that would be very
Mhm.
hard to figure because Russia was out of the war
And
de facto
Oh, and they
before
were-
it was de jure.
And they were doing so many other of their own problems by
Oh.
1918,
Yeah.
1919. They had so many other problems.
Well,
to
their
deal
civil
with.
war was
Right.
basically full squid.
Boom, up until 1921.
Yes, so you know they're pretty much out of the pictures here at the end of the war.
Yes.
But going back to that, coming to the table, you know, the Allies have lost so many people.
Right.
They have that tradition of taking colonies and demanding reparations. Somebody needs to pay us back,
It's just inevitable.
and they don't want to lose face.
No.
There's no way that it's Clemenceau is the
Mhm.
premier of France.
Mhm.
There's no way he can go to the electorate and say, "We've lost a quarter of your young men, and we're not going to get anything out of it." There's just no way
no,
he
he
could
would've-
go. He would never be reelected. He might be run out on a rail.
Probably the case,
So-
for sure.
They're coming, and of course Woodrow Wilson does not appreciate that. His 14 points really talk about the concept of mercy among nations,
Right.
A return to the status quo, except in those cases with these little nations,
Yes.
which of course gets adopted into the Treaty of Versailles. You get the creation of Yugoslavia, Austria, Hungary become separate countries, Czechoslovakia, Poland. These all become countries.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it allows Hitler to be right about something when he says these artificial states have been
course.
created.
Of course.
Yugoslavia is nothing but a Serbian puppet.
Yep.
The Croatians, the Bosnians, the Macedonians all hate the Serbs.
Yes.
So it's not a country that really has a long shelf life.
No.
It's preserved because Marshal Tito lives a long, long time.
Right.
But Czechoslovakia, they have their Velvet Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
1990s, they break into two countries because they don't really have anything in common.
No.
They're Czech and Slovak, literally
Right.
very different.
You know, in putting it in even into modern terms, which of course has its roots after World War I, the country of Iraq is very similar to this idea.
Yes, you have the Sunnis and the Shiites
Right.
that are pushed
Right.
together in an artificial idea.
Exactly, and how much problems that brings. Saddam Hussein
Well,
and his
the Sudan.
Mhm.
Now we have North
Sudan.
and South Sudan
Right.
because of that same very issue.
Right. It's the same way in all of these, what are called, again, those artificial states, that you have people literally putting it on a map room and say, okay, I'm going to draw a line here and that's my country.
Yep.
Okay.
Because you don't want too small of countries.
No.
Because that lets Germany get back in the game too quickly.
Right.
France was terrified that Germany had lost the war, but when it comes right down to it, France was losing the peace
Mm-hmm.
because of their casualty rates, the damage to their economy,
Yes.
just so much damage to them that their fear was Germany in 20 years would be back.
Ooh.
Ooh,
Mm.
foreshadowing again.
Wow.
Yeah. Almost to the day.
Exactly. And the thing about it as well is one thing that France was also afraid of is there were a lot of those socialists and almost communists in France that if France did not tie up what was happening with the treaty, that whole democracy would have fallen.
Yes, very much
and
so.
who knows what type of an ally we would have had in France.
Right.
Or,
Because
you know.
at this time, nobody can point a finger to a failed communist state and say,
No.
we don't want that in our country.
Right.
It's still the ideal of
Yes.
communism. Total equality, economically, politically.
Right.
I mean, even by the time signing of the Treaty of Versailles, you can see that Lenin's communist government isn't going to be it's not going to be the utopia of the masses.
No, it's not.
It's definitely
And,
not going to be that
well,
spot.
Yeah. But again, the treaty itself, the provisions of the treaty are
Effectively only affect Germany
right.
directly because it's the only one left.
Right. And again, they do their best to again punish them.
Yes.
It is a vindictive style of treaty. As you know, again, the French and the British, they are trying to put as much limit as they can on the Germans, limiting them to 100,000 soldiers.
Which is probably the same size as their police force, to be
again,
honest.
yeah,
I mean, when you add up all the cities and states.
And again, you have a very large amount of land you have to protect. 100,000 is not going to help you.
Especially when you have suddenly new and unstable countries on your
Yes.
border.
Yes.
But no Air Force,
Right.
because modern Air Force, of course, Germany,
Mm-hmm.
one of the first developers of strategic bombing,
Right.
flying both Zeppelins and bombers, Gotha bombers, over London.
Right.
So the French and the British both saw the future of that being bad for them.
The foreshadowing.
So we just say, no,
Mhm.
you don't get to have that. You can't have submarines because
Again,
Great
yeah.
Britain almost starved to death.
Right. The unrestricted submarine warfare that was taking place, especially in that North Sea, along the English Channel, even along Ireland's coast. It was bad. It was really bad for many of these northern countries. Then I can imagine why the British wouldn't want this to happen any longer. Unfortunately, it doesn't continue that way. But
It's one of the smartest dumb strategies in the history of warfare.
Exactly.
It almost strangles Great Britain.
Right.
It literally chokes off almost all of their foreign trade, which
Mhm.
they cannot survive without food.
Well, they're an island.
They're an island, and without Canada and Australia and India sending them food. Well, without India, there's no tea. I don't even
Right.
know what the British could do without
Oh my
tea.
God. No tea.
But because of the unrestricted nature,
Mhm.
it brings America into the war.
Exactly.
Which
Exactly.
means now all that stuff that America was building and charging for is
Mhm.
now also being used by the Americans free of charge.
Yes, by
And
anybody. By
another
anybody.
a million men from a fresh army
Oh yes.
of well-fed country boys coming to shoot Kaiser.
Yep. Well, there's a reason why they were called doughboys because
Yeah, they
not
they
just
looked like doughy boys.
exactly, not just
Right,
because
fresh.
of right, Again, you've got people who have been fighting for 3.5 years straight
On low rations.
on very low
I
rations.
mean, even if they were decent, because
Mhm.
the guys at the front were fed fairly well.
Yes.
But it just takes a toll on you, and you lose weight.
Yes,
most,
you do.
Most veterans in every war
Mhm.
lose weight at the front.
Hmm. But again, this provision of the Treaty of Versailles, you lose so much. You have, again, no army, or very little army, no air force, no submarines, loss of your colonies overseas. I mean, that again includes Africa. It includes the Asian colonies that they had. It includes any other.
A bunch of little islands.
Right, but again,
Several of which
it's-
will become back to us as we talk about the War of the Pacific.
right.
Truck was one of them.
Mhm.
Rabaul was
Mhm.
another one. There's a lot of those little islands that mean nothing on the map because you can barely see them.
But
But in the sake of the Pacific War, they become very important.
and again, in the idea of an empire,
That's stripped
that's the main
away.
thing.
Every aspect of the German Empire is gone. Kaiser is gone.
Yep.
All their colonies gone. Their
Yep.
navy is stripped away.
Mhm.
Their army is gone. There is nothing imperial left in Germany except some money.
And the
And it's not worth anything.
right. And the big thing that most historians can agree is the main, well, I wouldn't say the main spark of World War II, but the fact that Germany is forced to take blame for starting the war.
It's just such a blow because they know, anybody knows that they didn't start the war.
They were just there because they were entangled in foreign alliances.
Yes, and like we talked about earlier, once the Russian army started moving to the border, the war was going to happen.
The Germans had to improve.
They had to be offensive, otherwise they were going to get ground between two large forces.
Exactly.
So they had no choice to be. Yes, did their army move through neutral Belgium? Yes, so they didn't
But-
look very good.
No, but again,
It's hard to see a way for Germany to get out of it without abandoning Austria-Hungary,
exactly.
and that seems very unlikely. They've been tied by marriage and treaty
Mhm.
for 100 years.
Exactly.
Well,
Right.
50 years because
Right.
Germany didn't exist technically, but Prussia had,
Yeah.
and they were very close to the Austrian
And
throne
again,
as well.
and again, that's the thing. That's the thing that I feel, and I'm sure you would agree, that Hitler, again, bringing it back full circle almost, was so adamant that they did not have a reason to have their navy be stripped, their army to be squandered, their air force to be destroyed. And then, of course, all of those reparations, all the blame. I mean, why wouldn't, and I can understand, Austria-Hungary does not exist.
Right?
Serbia does not technically exist. It's under Yugoslavia.
Right.
But how are you going to blame someone who's an artificial state?
But Serbia is an ally.
Exactly.
What was it? Bulgaria was a bad
Mhm.
guy, but they just
Mhm.
lost a little territory.
They would lose this little section right here to Greece.
Yeah.
So they don't have access to the Aegean, but again,
Yeah, it's a bunch of mountains mostly.
right.
But also, we shouldn't forget, the end of the war, there's a young corporal
Oh,
laying in a hospital,
Mhm.
is blinded by
Yes.
mustard gas,
right,
weeping
right.
for, as his, I think Mein Kampf says, like a week.
Yeah.
I don't know if I take that
Wouldn't go
seriously.
that far, but,
But given Hitler's later emotional issues, maybe.
maybe it was. Yeah, you're
And
right.
it was big. He's
right.
he's a brave young soldier. He's got the Iron Cross
Right.
twice.
Yes.
That's not something you get if
Just-
you're a slacker.
Right. No.
And he's been wounded again,
Mm-hmm.
with this gas. And everything he wanted to be, because he left Austria specifically to get his German citizenship
Exactly.
and join the army.
Right.
And now they're destroying the country he tried to come into.
Mm-hmm.
It's an emotional blow that would be hard to measure.
And think about that. When Hitler is laying there with the news coming in of the armistice being signed,
Kaiser
Kaiser
Queens of
advocating, there's just this sense of why. I'm sure PTSD was a major problem with him at the beginning because of course he was blinded, he was running back and forth from the supply chain of the back infantry or back trenches to the front and back. That takes a toll on you. I don't know.
It'd be like cliff diving every day.
Right.
you're literally you're somewhat safe, and then you have to put yourself in a horribly dangerous place and then come back out, as opposed to the guys who were there, and you just get used to being there.
Yes.
I mean, to show that anyway. But you have all this, and the reparations. It's $32 billion
Right.
in gold.
Right.
So you can't inflate your currency
No.
to get out of paying it. You can't.
No.
Inflation can't help you.
No.
And if the price of gold goes up, it hurts you.
Uh-huh.
And that's about 560 billion after I asked Google, and they sent me to a site that does the inflation for you.
Yes.
And we're talking so over $500 billion in reparations. Plus, they already spent more than that on the war itself.
Right.
That is a lot of blood and treasure
Yes.
that has just gone from the economy.
Yes.
Because I mean, most of that treasure that they spent is in ammunition and weapons,
Right.
none of which is usable anymore.
No.
Or the Allies are busy blowing it up
Yep.
or sinking it.
Or whatever the case
Whatever
may
they're
be.
doing with it. Germany is in a bad place.
Well,
Economically. But the United States sort of comes to the rescue.
Exactly.
Because Woodrow Wilson cannot get, his 14 points kind of comes to bite him on the butt. He
Yeah.
can't get the Senate to ratify the treaty because it's too vindictive.
Yes.
Americans just can't get behind the idea of destroying a sovereign nation.
Well, and at the same time, how many German Americans are there
Oh.
living in this country? And yes, of course, World War I, you don't see as much, but there are quite a few families that will change their names. They will change their almost make new nationalities for themselves because again, they don't want to be seen as negative. They don't want to be seen as a Kaiser-loving German. I'm gonna keep moving forward for the fatherland.
Well, you see a lot of, Myers dropped the first E,
Right.
so it looks more English.
Right.
People just don't want to be associated with Germany, even people who are proudly German,
Right.
especially when you look at like Wisconsin and Detroit, Michigan and Chicago.
Mhm.
I mean, there's
Any
just
of
a
them.
lot of the Midwest is
Mhm.
settled by ethnic Germans.
Yes.
And so it's a big deal in the United States that even without Wilson's 14 points, you could see where there would have been a lot of resistance from
Yes.
the Midwestern senators
Right.
to sign a treaty that's this brutal in its destruction of a country. It's literally saying you can't defend yourself, you'll never be able to make war, and we're going to take your money too.
No thanks. Because what if that were to happen to us?
I think the word slaves were bandied about a couple times in the North,
I'm
which
sure.
would have been a good bloody shirt to fly it around, because
Yeah.
Woodrow Wilson, being a Southerner,
Mm-hmm.
Virginian.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I mean, it would be I think a big deal.
Yeah, for sure. So again, we as a nation, we don't advocate for the Treaty of Versailles. We in fact take a couple of years. We mull it over. We figure out, hey, what is best for Germany? What is best for ourselves?
So
What
we
is best-
basically wait for an election.
Good point. You're right. Because
Yeah.
it's not until 21 that we sign
Right.
that separate peace
Right.
treaty, which again will Wilson. He's already
Yeah.
weakened by his stroke that takes place in, when was that? 1919.
1919, early 1920.
Right as he was getting back from France, he was out in California, I believe, when that happened. I believe no, maybe that was.
All I know is that
Regardless-
we already had our first woman
Yep.
president.
Yep, Edith Wilson. Edith Wilson, who behind the scenes helps to force his hand on signatures to documents and met with the press and of course made sure he looked the part of the president. But
If
in
you ever see the
reality-
movie Dave, it's really based on that concept, that you have
Yes.
a president that becomes incapacitated.
Yes.
You manage his appearances. In a Dave, of course, they use a stand-in, but still,
Yeah.
you have this managing of the press.
Right.
But the press was a lot friendlier then to the
Yes.
president.
Oh yes.
I mean, we see it with Woodrow Wilson.
We saw it with
And then we see it with Roosevelt later.
Yes.
That most people in America don't know he's in a wheelchair until well after the war,
Yeah.
because the press helps. Because it's not something that's
It's a personal problem that the press should not pry into. It is not like today's personal affairs of the president or even the presidential candidates, where they dig every little detail out of the
Right.
closet and
You had 2 speeding
smear
tickets, you're in
it.
trouble.
Oh my gosh! you got caught cheating in first grade on a spelling test,
Yeah.
you're the worst person I'd ever met in my life. No, we don't do stuff like that in the 19-teens, 1920s. We have a little bit, I guess, more a little bit of class for the press.
Well, it's kind of, I think it's a whiplash, totally different subject, obviously. The press of the 1800s is very much like the press today.
Correct.
Where they dig up everything, if not just make up stuff.
Yep.
And so you see this brief period in the middle of, well, the 20th century, really.
Mm-hmm.
This concept of objectivity, this concept that certain things don't matter as far as a politician's concerned.
Right.
Because when you start digging up dirt on everybody, you could disqualify almost everybody on the planet from ever holding an office.
Exactly.
Because everybody's done something that wasn't, gosh dang, I pushed down Betty Ann at playground in second grade.
my
He's an
God.
abuser.
Yes.
But
okay.
we have this little honeymoon period, which helps build that cult of personality with Roosevelt
Right.
in the 30s and 40s, which obviously we'll come back to.
Yes, of course. But again, the United States, we do end up signing that second peace treaty, that separate peace
Yes.
treaty. We do not join the League of Nations, which is a precursor to the United Nations. But what the League of Nations really said was, okay, we're going to come together and we're going to prevent war, but we won't actually do anything about it.
I mean, as far as I understand it, the League of Nations had about the same ability to go to war as the United Nations, which isn't much.
No.
But you have to remember that the two big movers and shakers of the League of Nations, Britain and France,
Yeah.
are both taking a pretty hard tack to pacifism.
Mm-hmm.
After the war and the casualties of the war. They're not going to go fight for Haile Selassie in Ethiopia or the Armenians in Turkey.
No.
They're
no,
just
no,
not
no.
going to go to war for pretty much anything except self-defense.
Yes.
And so the League of Nations ends up as a paper tiger.
Yeah.
It has no ability to enforce its will.
No.
It really just gives them a fig leaf for making colonies out of the Middle East with
Yep.
their mandates.
Yeah.
It gives
Yeah.
them new colonies, so
Right.
therefore they can point to their voters that,
Oh,
we've
look
got
what
the
we've
oil
done.
from Iraq now.
Right, yeah.
We've
Got Syria and for France, and well,
I
that
don't know what
doesn't.
Syria had at that time. They might have had oil.
Maybe.
Falafel. I don't
Yeah.
know.
There you go.
But everybody else is exhausted by this war.
Oh, yes.
The Victorian largesse that had developed because of all these colonies that Britain had was pretty much spent on the war,
Right.
leaving Britain not broke, but definitely with a smaller bank account than they had before. The French are really close to broke.
Yep.
The United States, however, comes out of the war with money to burn.
Oh, God, yes.
Obviously, 1917, 1918 were great years because even out here in the middle of nowhere, Missouri, my church doubled its size because suddenly we had all this money pouring in to build, people put money into things that they enjoy, parks, churches, libraries.
Well, you got to look at it this way, too. The wheat production of the Midwest helped to fund the war, which, of course, that helped to put more money into the pockets of your farmers out in rural Kansas or rural Missouri.
And the finish of that industrialization and the railroads of,
Correct.
I mean, the railroads really pretty much reached their height by that
Right.
point.
Yes.
Which means now I can have a farm
Mm-hmm.
and I can still work in a factory that's 30 minutes away
Right.
because I can take the train every morning and come
Right.
home every night.
Mhm.
Really, you start getting your first commuter workforce, which means the wealth of the nation just goes
Increases like tenfold.
up, which is how we get the Roaring Twenties.
Yep.
But in the backdrop of the Roaring Twenties is U.S. banks have a ton of cash.
Yeah.
All these businesses have all this extra money they put into banks. Banks are looking to invest. Germans are paying top dollar to borrow money to help pay these reparations. And suddenly the United States is basically bankrolling the Treaty of Versailles.
Oh, for sure. We're the sugar daddy
Oh.
of Europe.
Our relationships with Germany, really, if it wouldn't have been Hitler and the Nazis, who were a bunch of buffoons when it comes right down to it,
Mhm.
if there would have been a lot of thinking people in the political side of Germany, they would have been like, do not ever declare war on America. They're the only reason we stayed afloat.
Yes. Yes. But unfortunately, again,
That also leads to the foreshadowing of what happens when Germany can't make a payment
yeah.
in, say, September of 1929.
Well, you party enough, you're gonna have a hangover.
Yeah, but, I mean, you look at America in the 1920s, other than Prohibition, which seems like a strange thing to
Especially
celebrate
during that
winning a
time.
war with.
Yeah,
But it is the culmination of the 19th century progressive movement.
correct.
That's their high water mark, so to speak.
Oh, it was definitely a high water
Yeah.
time for them. But again, you know, even with that, the Prohibition era, you're right, it starts
Profits everywhere.
Yes, it was.
Banks are loaning money to anybody because they have so much extra that they're not making enough money on the money they have.
Well, you know,
their balance sheets look weird.
The thing is we see a little bit of it going even today, and I'm sorry to go down this rabbit hole, but thinking about it in terms of like, I know it's a big issue topic, medical marijuana, recreational marijuana. Look at how much money California and Colorado, well, maybe not so much California, but definitely Colorado is making on that. It's almost like the situation of what's going on after World War I in America, just in a smaller scale. That state
Being able to
banking
have a
system.
sin tax.
Yes.
Being able to tax those things that people don't need but want.
Well, again, you have those starting during this time after the Prohibition era, those sin tax of alcohol, cigarettes, things along those
Especially
lines.
cigarettes, because they had to make up the money once alcohol became illegal.
Right.
Which was a double whammy to a lot of states.
Oh, gosh.
Because, like Kentucky, you have all this income coming from all these distilleries. That just goes away.
Right.
And now you have to pay for more police to enforce these rules.
Yikes.
That's a double whammy. So they have to start taxing other things, like cigarettes,
Right.
gas.
Right.
Things, again, see, we're not even to World War II, and we're already seeing the changes that are coming.
Right.
In a society that is becoming more urban and much more money oriented and less land oriented.
Right.
Because we're making the switch. What, 1930? Is that the year we split the 50-50 population?
Somewhere around that time, yeah.
It was 50% rural, 50% urban.
Yep.
And of course, because of the ease of transportation now, some of that rural slips into the urban sometimes.
Right, yeah, for sure.
You know, probably not on a massive scale, but enough to make differences in places like where we live.
Right.
Where you have a fairly large town with factories surrounded by rural areas supported by fairly good railroad networks.
Definitely. Which definitely brings us into that idea of now the dreaded Spanish influenza, which of course comes right at that end point of World War I.
And because the belligerents, all of them,
Right.
United States included, were so using censors to crack down on bad news.
Right.
The only real nation that most Western Europeans got their news from that was free press is Spain.
Right.
So they get the name, Spanish flu.
Unfortunately. And again, this is the thing many people don't quite understand. It did not start in France. Or even, no, I'm sorry, not Spain. It did not
may have
start
started in Spain, but we're not sure.
But again, we have evidence now that says it starts in Kansas.
Maybe at Fort Riley.
Fort Riley, just outside of Fort Riley.
I've seen some places say it started in the Far East.
Yes.
Which would follow the flu cycles that we know today.
True.
But nobody knows where it should really started because, of course, we can't track it in the middle of a war, and they didn't track things well then anyway.
No.
But because the Spanish are the only ones talking about this horrendous flu,
oh my gosh,
that's wiping out people so fast,
right?
Especially young adults. Again, that generation that's already been trashed.
You're looking at
by a war.
Yeah, you're looking at 20 to 30-year-olds who are contracting this influenza,
and it's killing them.
And it's
which is
devastating.
Backwards.
And again, it is doing it fairly quickly, which again is weird because you would think, being a 20-something, you'd have better immunity. You would have more of an immune system. But unfortunately, like you mentioned before off camera, this is a complete...
It's a flu that it had an extra little bit onto its RNA.
Right.
And that little bit basically turned the immune system into your opponent instead of your ally. So the people with the best immune systems,
20 to
30-year-olds, now suddenly find themselves dying of what is normally kills only the very young and the very old.
Right.
Obviously, there's always exceptions, but those exceptions usually have other reasons, asthma, tuberculosis at this time, and things like that. And it's a scary disease. Lots of lots of the same things we just got done seeing.
Right.
Public closures,
Right.
schools not closing so much as going outside.
Yeah.
Literally having class in a parka
Right.
on a roof
Mm-hmm.
so that you can stay spread apart.
Right.
And it worked.
Mm-hmm.
We couldn't pull it off, but they did.
Yeah.
But
but-
they had the same violent reactions.
Yes.
People got tired very quickly of being locked in their homes.
Exactly.
Not being able to earn a living,
Mhm.
not being able to go get what they needed from the store,
Mhm.
and the store's not having what they needed to begin with.
Mhm.
There's the same pushback, which is I find very ironic, and I think part of it is America, part of it is I think just humans.
Yeah. You're told not to do something, so you want to do it more.
Well, I mean, if you're sitting around and you're stuck in your house, you don't have a radio,
Right.
you don't have a television,
No.
you literally maybe not even getting a newspaper every
What do you
day
want?
yet.
You play ball in a cup.
Play ball in a cup, and you think about the things you can't do anymore.
Exactly.
It would be very hard. And it came and went throughout the United States,
Mhm.
caused a lot of people lose their teeth.
Yeah. Weird.
It was for some reason affected teeth, but it killed.
It was a little over what we said about 100.
It killed about 2% of the population, give or take, depending
Yeah.
on the country. America, once
600,
again,
yeah.
taking less than typical.
Correct.
Because we're the doughboys,
Right.
well fed.
Right.
We got food. We got so much food we don't even know what to do with
And
it.
again, we didn't have the devastation of the war.
None of it.
We didn't have anybody coming into our nation, tromping on our people, or killing a large portion of even our civilian population. You know, of the
The Lusitania is our biggest loss.
Exactly.
I mean-
and that wasn't that. Geez, that was just
117 or
Uh-huh.
something like that. Civilian-wise, the war is very
Right.
friendly.
right.
But even our military casualties are such a small percentage
Yes.
of the population as a whole. It barely makes it dead. It's not one. It's like if you're looking at a graph, it's like a dip,
Yeah.
as opposed to like France where it's a trench.
Huge
You know,
drop.
even
on
Germany,
there.
it's a good sized
Yes.
chunk.
But again, of the 50 million people worldwide that died, the United States only had just about that 750,000 people.
Right.
You compare that to places such as, you know, again, Germany and France and Great Britain.
You know, I guess number-wise, looking at those numbers, it's about the same proportion.
But
we don't know
again-
what that looks like in Central America.
Right.
Because the records are so
Correct.
sparse.
Correct.
It's kind of like COVID in India and
Right.
Africa.
Right.
We just don't know how many people died there.
Exactly.
And we probably never really will.
No, you never, because their governments are not
They
well
just don't have
equipped
to do
like
the
we
record
do.
keeping, and medical facilities are few and far between in a lot of places. It makes it difficult to really know the damage that was done by the Spanish flu. But the real thing that makes it the big deal is it's on top of the damage. It starts in
Correct.
1918. It
Yes.
gets brought back to America, maybe, or it was already here.
Whenever,
we don't
whatever
know.
might have been the
But,
case, but
either way, we know it starts going back and forth, obviously,
yes.
because it shows up on troop ships.
right.
And so we know that this is causing an issue. And those outbreaks center around ports, which,
Mhm.
if you go back to the bubonic plague, if you
It's
look at a
just
map of how it
like it.
spread, it's just by
Yep.
the ports.
Yeah.
It's a big deal because it's a lot more loss of life on top of a massive loss of life.
And you got to think about it again, like France. France lost how much of their population during that time? About 5%. Of
Almost
the
5% of their
population.
population was dead.
You have 5% of the population dead from the war, and then you tack on another 250,000.
So another, what, another percent, maybe.
Right, but even that is a lot because of those 250,000 that died, 30,000 of those were soldiers who
Right.
were still trying to get better or at least try to recover from this war. It was not. It was not. a good-
Imagine the morale drain.
Oh
You
my
survive
gosh.
4 years on the Western Front. You finally get to come home to Liverpool
Yes.
in England, and 2 weeks later you're on your deathbed from the flu. Or
Yeah.
worse yet, you finally come home and your wife is dying,
Right.
or your children are dying of the flu.
Right.
The psychological impact is pretty huge, which leads us to the Roaring Twenties in America. France becomes famous for its libertine ways.
Oh my
Josephine
gosh, yes.
Baker and
Yes,
the
yes,
whole
yes.
banana dress thing.
Right, right. And well, of course, you have also people such as Ernest Hemingway, the Lost Generation, F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Oh, yeah. Very
all of
depressed
this-
writers.
Yes, they're living in this heyday of America and in Europe, but they're doing it because they're masking that depression.
Most of them had seen war in some fashion or another.
Ernest Hemingway was an ambulance driver in France. You know,
Right.
he saw firsthand.
Well, he saw the worst of it all.
Yes.
Because there was no victory for him. It was just bodies and
Yes.
and
Exactly.
wounded all the time.
Exactly.
It's
I don't know if Fitzgerald ever served, but you think about it though, he's again of the generation.
mhm.
He's of this individual group that had went through the war, is now going through what is the Spanish influenza and seeing how devastating it is for the people.
Well, and very Euro focused.
Right.
They know a lot of people in France and
Right.
England. When they talk to them, it's got to rub off on you.
Of course.
So we have this undercurrent. You have this, you have the flappers, jazz age.
Woo.
You just have all this stuff going on that seems like a party. But on this undercurrent, there's a lot of fear.
Yep.
There's fear there could be another war. When we'll talk about that in a later episode about the various methods they try to prevent another war.
Yes.
But
You also have some racial underpinnings.
Well, then you have the communist scares that'll come, and we'll talk about those as we kind of try to peel off into areas of the world
Mhm.
as we lead into World War II. I don't think we're going to spend too much time on the 20s,
No.
Other than Italy, because they get Mussolini early.
Yay!
The grandpappy of fascism.
Yes.
Oh, goody.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
El Duce himself.
And and we'll talk about of course communism
With the Russians.
with the
yes.
Russians. But our goal really is to get us to World War II. I don't know,
Quickly.
2 or 3 episodes
Yeah,
at
yeah,
most.
yeah. We don't want to drag out the interwar period very much.
No, there's a lot of stuff going on, but a lot of it's just everyday stuff.
Yeah.
It's not super important.
No.
We're going to try to pick the highlights. Obviously, people like Mussolini and Hitler and Lenin are all going to become vitally important to the understanding of what we're going to do. Well, Hoover. I mean,
Of course.
he basically gets his job because he's an FBI agent going after commies.
Yeah. J. Edgar Hoover, not
Yes.
Herbert.
Not Herbert. Herbert's a different guy.
Yep.
He was a cool guy.
But he actually got his job, believe it or not, as a commerce secretary.
Well, he was also, during the war, he was like the secretary of one of the war-created
Yep.
boards
Yeah.
that helped feed Europe and America.
Yep.
And, he
But
was-
again, he was a good guy.
he was a
He
good
was the
person.
good guy. Yes.
You can trash his presidency all you want, but he was a good person.
Mm-hmm.
Well, all of it. He even visited the White House under Truman
Right.
20 years later. So
Right.
obviously he couldn't have been that bad of a guy.
No.
But that brings up the end of World War I.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that the table is set, in Germany especially,
Oh yes.
that there's going to be some hankering for some payback.
Yes, they are chomping at the bit for sure.
Well, at first, they're just trying to figure out what the heck to do with themselves, but we'll talk about that in another
Yeah.
episode.
Yeah.
All the trials and tribulations they go through, which is a lot, really, compared to the
Yes.
other nations
It is.
other than Russia. Everybody else seems pretty stable comparatively.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
But anyway, again, please make sure you tune in. Make sure that you give us any suggestions you might have. And again, we are going to be here for a good chunk of time here on this series.
Well, at least getting up to the war, hopefully just like maybe 2 more or maybe 3 more episodes to get to the beginning of the actual shooting.
Right.
After that, we're going to play that by ear because, well, that's when we really get nerdy.
Yes. Definitely. Definitely. We are going to be in our.
Yes.
Yes.
That's the history nerd sweet spot. So,
Anyway,
we'll
yes.
see you next time.
Definitely. Enjoy.